welcome. And who we have on this webinar are the new DVRN members, as well as some new or newish staff from some of the longer-term DVRN organizations. And we also have a number of our FIPSA office colleagues. So who I think, you all can see the list there, but let me attach people to organizations. So with the capacity building and program technical assistance for FIPSA formula grantees, that's NNEDV, National Network to End Domestic Violence. It's my understanding we have Kim Gandy, Beth Meeks, Reen Rennick, and Tanya Moultrie, right? Mm-hmm. That's who's there from those folks. With the National Capacity Building Center to expand services for children and abused parents impacted by domestic violence, which is a project of Futures Without Violence, we have Liana Kinnicut. And with Ujima.
And I'm here too. This is Lana. I'm on my way, trying to get in.
Oh, excellent. Hey, Lana. Good to hear your voice. And I don't know if we have Tiffany.
Yes, I'm here.
She's here. Excellent, Tiffany. And with the National Capacity Building Center on Safe and Supportive Housing, we're expecting Christy Bevis, who's starting with us on Monday. I don't know if she's made it on yet. I don't think so. Okay. And with the LGBT resource, the Northwest Network, the former learning, so they're kind of not new to the DVRN, but they're new as an institute. So we're excited to just note that transition. And we have Margaret on the webinar. And then
hello, everybody.
Hi, Margaret. And other folks, we have Elizabeth with National Center for Juvenile Family Court Judges and the Child Protection Child Custody Resource Center. We have Kutsia Raja from the the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So we're glad that she's joined us. And we have a couple folks from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. We have Rachel, Carla, and Heather. Is there anyone that... And then we have Sue Osthoff with the National Clearinghouse of Defense of Battered Women, and her colleague Dot, and this is Ann Menard with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So who did we miss? I think we got everybody. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to advance slides. So, and Sue wanted me to mention that your colors, she did this slide, and your colors do not mean anything. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to just say is, as we start out here, is that we are trying to not focus on things that we're going to be talking about at the DVRN meeting next week, because we don't want that to be duplicative of the folks that are there. So we just wanted to say that. So we're trying to focus on sort of foundational things that we aren't covering next week. But feel free to chat questions in or interrupt. We are allowing time at the end for questions. So let's get going.
And this is Sue O. I just want to add that at this point, because it doesn't sound like anyone is in a Starbucks or driving, we will leave everybody unmuted. If it starts becoming a problem, we'll mute folks, and then Ann and Kenya, I'll ask you guys to unmute yourselves, okay, and give you instructions how. So just quickly, you can see what we want to do in this next about hour or so. But as Ann said, we really want to leave questions. And one of the big questions that we want to answer is how come we don't meet in Montana anymore? So we will get to that at the end.
So, and I would also just say, as a disclaimer, there's really not one DVRN story. It's really depending on who you ask and how good or bad or selective their memories are, what story you will get about some of this early history in particular. So this is kind of Sue's and mine, and with some input from Kenya's version of what we think is true. So we're not intentionally misrepresenting anything. But so I want to just do a very brief statutory history of the creation of the DVRN. So it really was advocates in 1991, 1992 that suggested that FIPSA, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which was originally authorized in 1984, created the first federal funding stream for domestic violence, community-based domestic violence programs, and really it deserves a lot of credit for creating the network of domestic violence programs that we have now. But in the reauthorization of FIPSA, FIPSA has been reauthorized many times through different vehicles. It's technically a part of the Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, but it has also been reauthorized as part of the Violence Against Women Act, and so it has a really kind of active legislative history. But in 1991, 1992, the advocacy community at that time, there weren't coalitions in every state at that time. There weren't, there wasn't NRCDV did not exist at that time. Got together and identified the need to, in addition to funding domestic violence programs at the state and tribal levels, it was important that FIPSA funds be made available to state domestic violence coalitions, so that happened at the same time, and resource centers. And can you, I can go to the next slide. And I want to just point out to you the second to last two paragraphs is how in our first 5-year report, some people love this report and some people had other feelings about this report, but it's interesting to read that how it was framed is that we had all of these domestic violence programs being created. We had law enforcement and courts who were being encouraged to take domestic violence seriously, and so this third paragraph down says, how could they respond to everyone's requests for information, research, and models to support this burgeoning movement? What were we going to do with all the well-intended newcomers who didn't quite get it? How were their sisters across the country dealing with all of this? In their wisdom and desperation, the now viewed as not so radical sisters decided that resource centers could provide great relief. After many years of effort, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act provided for the establishment of resource centers to assist them, and grants from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services created the Domestic Violence Resource Network in 1993. So that's one interesting version of history, which Sue and I were like, oh, okay. So this was a report that was created 5 years from 1990, so late 90s. The language actually called for funding of 1 national resource center and 6 special issue resource centers. Well, they didn't call them that, but resource centers that address 6 issues. It was, the FIPSA staff was super small at that point, and we're going to get to Bill Riley in a minute. There was a decision to create 1 national resource center and 3 special issue resource centers because that was more manageable for the FIPSA office, which was basically a 1-person office at that time. So BWJP, Better Women's Justice Project, was created to cover the collapsed issues of civil justice, criminal justice, and self-defense issues. And child protection and child custody issues were collapsed into 1 resource center rather than 2, and the National Center for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, applied for and received that first resource center. Health was left as a separate issue area. So the first funding was released in 1993, and just to complete this, kind of statutory conversation, the statutory funding for the National Indian Resource Center addressing domestic violence and safety for Indian women, which is what it's called in the statute, was created, I think, under the 2002 reauthorization of FIPSA. And statutory references to fund culturally specific resource centers was accomplished in the 2010 reauthorization, although funding for the culturally specific resource centers had been provided using FIPSA discretionary funds prior to that. So that ends the brief run-through on the statutory. These are the original resource centers that were funded starting October 1st, 1993. Most were not staffed until the very beginning of 1994, but you can see some of the folks that were involved, the 4 resource centers that were funded, and people that were involved at the time. And we felt it was important to acknowledge folks that have been here for that whole scheme. I came in as the director of the resource center in January 1994. So some of us have been around for a long time. The expectation from the very beginning was that we would meet together, and we wanted to meet together. We wanted to, we were creating these things that hadn't existed before. I remember thinking a lot I don't know how to create a resource center, but we all figured it out. This was pre-OVW funding, so the Office on Violence Against Women, the Violence Against Women Act hadn't been passed. None of that was there. So one of the first things we, did as we were organizing ourselves was to work with the FIPS office around how to allocate the available funds given that they had kind of collapsed these issue areas. So from the very beginning, we tried to pay attention to making sure that each of these important areas of domestic violence response had resources to support technical assistance. The other thing I would say about this first year, 1994, was that within 3 months of the National Resource Center opening, and I think we all opened about the same time in April of 1994, O.J. Simpson was arrested for the murder of his wife and her friend, and there was, for those of you around at that time, there was really a national teach-in about domestic violence and a lot of pressure to provide support to local programs and the coalitions that existed at that time and how to respond to that media interest and that national discussion that was happening. And then a couple months later, the Violence Against Women Act was passed. So there was a lot of interesting reinforcement for the role, the need for resource centers and the roles that we could play. I would also note that 2 years later, in 1996, the Welfare Reform Act also passed, which again underscored the importance of the work that the resource centers were set up to do. I'm going to the next slide. So here's Bill Riley. A little bit about Bill, and we went back and forth about whether we wanted to include this, but we thought because we still reference Bill, this is who we're talking about. This is the wonderful Bill Riley. He was really a one-person shop. He was the first staff person for the Family Violence Prevention and Services Office, so he predates all of us coming in. But there's many things to say about Bill Riley, but one of the things in terms of the DVRN in particular, he really was the visionary behind the creation of the culturally specific resource centers. He began working with Oliver Williams and Sheila Hankins, who he met at the National Family Violence Conference in Pittsburgh, about creating IDVAC, the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, which is now the predecessor organization to UJIMA. He had a vision for a big DV conference, the Millennium, which turned into the Millennium Conference, ending domestic violence in Chicago in 1999. He really was kind of a force of nature, but he also held us he really held us all in his hands and his heart, and he also relied on us to be adjunct staff for his office. So he really set the tone, I think, for the ways that the Resource Center works with the FIPSA office. He stayed into the beginning of the Bush administration to protect our programs, and also until Mary Louise could be convinced to come in as director, so he could finally retire. And we roasted him to great laughter, and I think even some tears, but we did that quite lovingly. So this is Bill Riley. So Sue might have additional things to say about Bill, but I'm going to pass it on to her.
We can talk about it next week. So just briefly, this is just an overview of some of the resource centers that, some of which Ann already mentioned, that ended up joining after that initial bunch. And I think really what we want to say about this, it's just really important to note that each of these resource centers, or what eventually became resource centers, or these new members, they've been doing a lot of organizing, some of them for many years, and often without any funding at all before they receive funding from DHHS. So I think it's also important to note that very early on, I think really in those, like one of the first or second meetings that we had in 1994, there was recognition that the already existing special issue resource centers and the National Resource Center could never adequately address the huge range of, hugely complicated issues in Indian country. And so very early on we started pushing to set up a specific resource center for Native women. And you can see in the timeline there that the hotline was funded in 1995 and opened in 96, and in 1997 Sacred Circle, they started coming to the DVRN, although as Ann described, they weren't funded statutorily until 2002. I think I think the folks on this call probably know all of those acronyms. Ann already talked about IDVAC. API Institute was the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence, and Alianza, the National Latino Alliance for the Elimination of Domestic Violence. They joined as institutes in 2000. We think IDVAC came in 1996, as it says there. We're not positive. We're confirming that. And the API Institute, I think has changed its name to the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And then, going down, NRCDV was a member for 3 years because they were the TA provider to what was called the Open Door to Safety grants. And then you'll see that the National Center on DV Trauma and Mental Health, CASA, and the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center joined in 2011. And Ann already talked about the LGBTQ DV Learning Center. So I think we can go on now. We can, and as Ann said, those are highlights. There were lots of things that happened in between, and that's probably better talked about over drinks, for those of you who drink.
Totally, right. Even ginger ale, yes. Okay. And this is just really a repeat of the first slide, which identifies the new resource centers that were new resource centers or institutes. The term resource centers really dates from that initial set of centers that all had that name, and then again there were institutes. The institutes have now become centers, but we have capacity building centers, we have institutes, and so our language is a little, probably needs to evolve a little bit, given that we've got different variations on the theme now. I also just want to acknowledge that also on the phone we have, or also on the webinar, we have a number of our FIPSA colleagues. Damien, it looks like Damien's there. I see Rachel, Seema, and I think that's it. And then of course we're going to hear from Kenya in a minute. So we just want to, we're in the process of updating what we call a DVRN, brief descriptions sheet, and we hope to have that for the meeting next week, and obviously we'll have an online version as well. But and it will. So we're not going to spend a lot of time, talking about the resource center. We just want to make sure that you had a handle on the current DVRN members, so include the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And this is the set that was just, we've just received our next 5-year awards. We have the other thing I would just say is that membership in the DVRN is defined by being a FIPSA-funded national TA provider. So the DVRN was created as a vehicle for us to coordinate and to work with the FIPSA office. And the other thing I would just note, because this gets a little fuzzy sometimes, is that the resource centers themselves, in other words, the TA providing entity that is funded, are members. But some, like for example, the Health Resource Center, is a project of the Futures Without Violence. And so some are part of larger organizations. I mean, technically, the Health Resource Center is the DVRN member, and the Child and Youth TA Center. So those are two projects. The Health Resource Center and the Children's Center are both projects of Futures Without Violence. But it's the resource centers, it's those resource centers that come and are part of our conversation. So again, it's a little bit, not all of the resource centers are part of larger organizations. Some of us are independent organizations and are really defined by our funding as resource centers. But just wanted to note that because sometimes that's confusing to folks outside. There are 4 special issue resource centers: Battered Women's Justice Project and the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, whose logo is right under there, is a partner in the Battered Women's Justice Project. We have the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the Child Protection and Child Custody Resource Center, Futures, which now has these 2 resource centers, and the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. We have 3 culturally specific resource centers: the API GBV, National Latino Network, which is the successor organizations to Alianza, which was an original member of the Resource Center, and we have the successor to the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, UJIMA, and I think this is the first time I've seen their wonderful logo. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very cool. And we have other Resource Center partners. And again, we have the National LGBTQ Institute on Infant Partner Violence, which is a project of the Northwest Network in partnership with the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. And the hotline is not a resource center, but has always been part of the DVRN and really provide a lot of richness, as do all of the members. So what do we do? I'm going to get to the purpose in a minute, but I wanted to just give you a sense of kind of what we do together. As I mentioned, we began meeting from the beginning in the first, and in the first 15 years, we fell into a 2-meeting per fiscal year pattern. The first meeting, one meeting focused excuse me, on policy issues, and we called it our policy meeting, although that wasn't all we talked about. It was typically in DC. And the other meeting was typically organized with the state domestic violence coalition, typically one that was low resourced or whose members often don't have access to national TA resources. So hence Montana. That's why we were meeting in Montana, and that beautiful backdrop. We've had these meetings in Birmingham, Alabama. We organized a meeting with the Georgia Coalition, the Arizona Coalition. We've probably done 10 or so over the years. We've met with the hotline twice, so we've gone down and organized our meeting with the hotline, a day and a half learning from them and providing, giving them access to the resources that the DVRN represents. And then we would have a business meeting as well. So in the last several years, we haven't done those training meetings, in part because a couple things. The FIPSA office couldn't travel, so we wanted to be able to have our FIPSA colleagues meet with us, and we had a lot of stuff to do and to do together. So we had meetings that also invested on our own continued development as resource centers. There's a lot of collaborative spirit in the DVRN. I think a real deep appreciation for how much we had to learn from each other about being resource centers, but also doing the work. There's been a recognition from the beginning, I think, that there are a number of cross-cutting issues or considerations in our work, like confidentiality is an issue that, regardless of the settings, the technical assistance is occurring in is an important issue. Vulnerable populations are important issues in, various aspects of the work that we do. So I think the DVRN meets a need that many of us feel to make sure that we have access to colleagues that can help keep our work informed and paying attention to issues that are important. There's a lot of both formal and informal partnerships amongst DVRN members. Some of the formal partnerships come in response to requests from the FIPSA office that we bring the different perspectives that we have as resource centers to bear on a particular issue, and I'll give some examples in a minute. But I think many of us, when we're developing our 5-year and our annual proposals to the FIPSA office, look for ways that we can work with partners, either in developing resources or co-sponsoring training or getting training from one of our resource center partners, and just really advancing the work in that collaborative way. So I think that's certainly something I appreciate, and others have mentioned when they reflect on the DVRN when it's doing its best work. Thanks, Sue, for posting all the other places that we had been. Yeah, good. Rhode Island, California 2 times. Detroit, that's right. We had a great meeting in Detroit. North Dakota, Mississippi, right. So just thinking about the kind of the activities that we engage in at our meetings and in between meetings. We typically have 2 meetings per year. We have periodic management team calls. We use those to plan the DVRN meeting, like the one that's happening next week, and we usually have a planning group, but then we bring it back to the management team to make sure that we're using the time well. The last 2 calls over the last 3-4 months have focused on sharing information about the transition that we're still in the middle of, and the implications it might have for the work that we do. We have, some of you were just on the call where I got to walk through the DVRN FIPSA services data reporting process and the forms. That was developed at DVRN meetings with work groups in between. And again, for those of you that weren't on the call, that was a process that was important to help us better document the scope and reach of our work, not only as individual resource centers, but as a network of resource centers funded by the FIPSA office, and to give information to the FIPSA office that helps them explain what it is we're doing, why funding resource centers is an important part of the larger network of services and supports that they provide. We also, critical conversations is aspirational largely, but we several years ago identified a real interest and a real interest in using some of our time at DVRN meetings to engage in critical conversations on issues that, again, cut across the work that we do, represent emerging challenges. And so we have, so we brainstormed a list, and there are, we have been successful at times to have those conversations, but it's something that we want to figure out how to build in to our meeting time or figure out other ways to do that. A lot of us are engaged in conversations through other venues, but we want to try to figure out how to have that happen within the DVRN context. We also engage in collaborative projects, as I mentioned earlier, in response to the administration's priorities or FIPSA priorities or DVRN member interests. So examples include under the Obama administration, AIDS, HIV, and violence against women was a priority issue, and there had been a lot of interagency work. And the FIPSA office pulled those of us, the resource centers that had something to contribute to the thinking on that together, and asked us to coordinate and keep them informed of the work that we were doing that, again, contributed to this larger effort at the federal level. It's similar around anti-trafficking work that was being done on a interagency task force level, and that was something that the several of the DVRN agencies were working on individually, but with under the direction of the FIPSA office, we sort of combined forces. We also have on several occasions asked for and received meetings with leadership within HHS as an opportunity to identify for them priorities that we're hearing from the field, and provide recommendations for things that they could do administratively that would help advance our work. And we certainly do that in collaboration with the FIPSA office. So we've done that a couple of times, and that's actually something that we will need to begin thinking about as more important positions are filled within the new administration, that we would typically want to set up an introductory meeting and make sure they understand. So, for example, with the Assistant Secretary for the Administration for Children and Families, which was Wade Horn under the Bush administration, and I can't remember who the first person was, but then ended up being filled by Mark Greenberg. And we met, and often we do that. For example, we often coordinated that with NRCDV and had a couple coalitions and representatives of the DVRN, and just made sure that they understood and appreciated the role that we all play in domestic violence policy and practice. And that they understood the importance of technical assistance. We also use DVRN meetings to do cross-training. Most recently, I think, was the training that Chick Dobby and the API GBV did on language access and the resources that they have, but also the legal requirements and the best practice requirements of ensuring language access in all of the various settings that we are providing technical assistance to. We also, for 4 years, I think, have been engaged in a DVRN evaluation project, which is gives us an opportunity to look at what it is, how do we evaluate the technical assistance and training that we provide, and its impact on the field. And so looking at questions like, I'll just use this example, we have great metrics on VAWNet. We know the number of people that come every day to VAWNet, how many documents are downloaded, what kinds of things are downloaded. But we don't have a really good way, unless we want to harass people with a survey every time they come, what they're doing. So we know they download this document, or we know that 5,000 people downloaded this document. What did they use it for, and did it help them in the work that they were doing, either whether that was to design a program or to get funding for a program or to convince a legislator to do something, and all of us have those dilemmas. So we've been working with an evaluator and really looking deeply at how we do this as national TA providers, and have a report. We've had several reports. There'll be another one provided at the meeting next week. And that led us to some interesting conversations about what are we trying to evaluate, and who are we? Who are we as a DVRN? I think we're all pretty clear who we are as individual resource centers, but what is this thing? And that led to a process that Amy Sanchez, now at Break the Cycle, led us through looking at what is it? What is our purpose? And that's the next slide. So this is our purpose statement, which we actually adopted in 2016. And it says we're about individual and collective strategic action to advance public policy, institutional change, community response, and prevention initiatives that integrate and respond to the diverse realities and needs of survivors, their families, and their communities. So this captures, obviously, that captures a lot of values that I think many of you hold as individual agencies and advocacy organizations, but we also felt like that bound us together. And that individual advocacy efforts of DVRN members, so each of us individually, are informed by the wide range of expertise within the network and strengthened by opportunities for critical thinking and robust discussion of cross-cutting policy and practice issues. So that's what brings us together to continue to advance our work. I wanted to just take one more minute before I turn it over to Kenya to just acknowledge the relationship, the overlap with the National Task Force on Sexual and Domestic Violence. We intentionally didn't include or recommend that all of the DVRN members be members of the National Task Force. Although many of us are. So the National Resource Center, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Futures Without Violence, the API GBV, CASA, their National Latino Network, and UJIMA, the Hotline, and Northwest Network. Northwest Network is joining the NTF, are all NTF members. And what we commit to do is to make sure that the DVRN, when there are issues that come up on the NTF, that have implications for the other DVRN members who are not represented on the NTF, that we bring that information to them. So there's a close connection, but there's not a total overlap, and that was intentional. So I think, Sue, unless there's anything that you would add, I'm going to turn it over to Kenya.
Nothing to add at this time, Ann. Thank you. That was really helpful. So Kenya?
Okay, hi. Thank you, Ann and Sue, for that. If possible, thank you. I was going to ask if you can advance the slides for me since I'm not logged in myself. So I wanted to speak a little bit. I'm Kenya Fairley with the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. We're located within the Family and Youth Services Bureau, which is located within the Administration for Children and Families and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and talked a great deal about our history and our statutory purpose and funding and things of that nature. So I just want to share a little bit more information with you about our focus and our role in what we do here. So within FSB, our mission is to support the organizations and communities that work every day to put an end to youth homelessness, adolescent pregnancy, and domestic violence. So there are actually 3 programs within FSB. So we have the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, APP, which is our Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program, and then the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. Ultimately, our philosophy and our core principles that we really try to focus on here in FSB is to promote interventions that are grounded in evidence, so really seeking to be evidence-informed in the work that we do, and then also providing trauma-informed services that allow for healing and recovery from violence, neglect, and abuse. So those are the things that we really seek to promote through all of our programs here at FSB, and we work closely together to collaborate amongst the different programs that we have here. So on the next slide, you'll see where we fit kind of within the Department of Health and Human Services, within FSB, and then we have the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. And what I want to say about that is that we are a bit of a small team here. So we have, we're divided up with Mary Louise as the director, and then we have the formula team and the program development team. So for a lot of us here in FISB and in FIPSA, and even for a lot of you, this structure is a little bit new. As Ann said and has talked about, the FIPSA program staff being a relatively small group and beginning with it being one person and then growing bit by bit over the years. And so now we have about 11 program staff that are seeking to support all of our grantees and the work that we do all around the country. And we also, at this time, have some vacant positions. So we're still a little bit understaffed, but we're certainly much larger than what we've been in previous years. So it's really exciting that we have such a great team here working on both the program development team and the formula team. And next week at the in-person meeting, a lot of you will have an opportunity to meet those folks in person if you've not already done so up to this point. But a lot of the folks on the team come from the field, so you may be familiar with them from their work either in local programs or at various domestic violence state coalitions. So we can go on to the next slide. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we have a broad network of domestic violence services that we fund. So not only local programs that provide emergency shelter services, but we also fund programs that provide non-shelter services such as counseling, legal advocacy, housing advocacy, public policy education, enhancing services to children, and really a broad network of programs and services that we're really seeking to meet the needs of survivors and their dependents all around the country. So you can see on this slide here also that we fund the state and territory coalitions, and then we also fund a large number of tribal programs. So we fund the tribes to do work specifically, and Ann talked about this as well, and Sue talked about this, to do work specifically within Indian country to help advance and expand the services that are available to victims there who have a very unique and special set of needs that are a bit above and beyond what most local programs can respond to. And some exciting news that happened this week is we worked with the hotline and the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center to launch Strong Hearts Native Helpline. And so that's a new service that's being provided and being offered. And so I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that at the DVRN meeting next week. But it's a really exciting opportunity just to know that we're continuing to expand services for Native communities. So we're really thrilled and excited about that and very honored to be able to be a part of supporting those efforts. You can also see, as Ann and Sue have already talked about, the National Resource Centers, Special Issue Resource Centers, and Culturally Specific Resource Centers that we fund. And then the last couple of things I'll say, and of course I want to be able to answer any questions that may come up, but I just wanted to show that on the next slide that we do serve millions of families all around the country all throughout the year. And so this slide just gives you an example of the breadth of work in terms of the families that we seek to support through ensuring that federal dollars are being allocated to support the needs of victims of domestic violence and their family. So you can see that there's a huge number of crisis calls that are being responded to, not only through state coalitions or state-sponsored hotlines, but then there's an additional number of millions of calls that are also being answered through the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and so they also keep their own numbers and they go above and beyond to answer the call of survivors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. So it's really an amazing service that's being provided through the National Domestic Violence Hotline and through Love is Respect, which focuses on serving youth populations and being able to meet their needs not only by responding to crisis calls, but also offering chat services as well. So we're really excited about the ways in which we're seeking to meet the needs of young people who may be reaching out for support and assistance. And then you can also see some of the work of the tribal grantees in terms of the number of calls they respond to and the victims they serve. So we, when I was at the NRCDV previously, we did work around the learnaboutfipsa.com or learnaboutfipsa.org website. And in honor of the 30th anniversary of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, created this moving picture infographic, which really talks about the history of PHPSA, the services that are provided, and the help and the resources that are being provided to survivors in the work that we do. So it's a wonderful website. There's a lot of great information there, so I certainly encourage anyone to go to learn more about PHPSA, our programs, the resources that are provided, and we hope to expand and update that resource later this year to also talk about some of the new priorities that will be coming up and things of that nature. So that's just a quick bit about the Family Violence Prevention and Services program here. So I think now we want to make sure that we have time for questions or comments, and so I'm going to pass it back over to Ann and Sue to moderate that.
Thanks so much, Kenya. Those numbers are really something to see all on one slide. Wow. A lot of depth. So we actually have a lot of time for questions. The one thing before we get into the questions that I did want to add is, as Ann said in the beginning, this is a brief history, and if you ask 5 different DVRN members, you'd probably get 12 different history accounts. So, just note that. And also, I think different questions are going to come up after your first meeting. And we can do a part 2, or we can do something informally if you need or want. So don't feel like, you have to know everything now. And we're all still learning too. Things change. Things have changed over time. And, we have a new opportunity to create a new future with new people here. So I just don't want people to feel like, okay, that was the history, that's it. It really is something that I think is worthwhile learning a bit more about, and some of it will be more relevant to some of you than others, and we're just available. A lot of people will be available at the meeting who will be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and Sue, this is Kenya. I just wanted to jump in again and say, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and it's been interesting since I've joined the PHPSA program. I've only been here since the end of December, and so being able to come on and talk about my experience and what I know about the DVRN has been really interesting, because there is such a rich and diverse history, even just from my what seems like a short 6 years or so, almost 7 years with the NRCDV, and just how much things have changed and grown. And I also do want to say that because we are federally funded and, we have statutory requirements, that oftentimes priorities and the focus of the administration does change as we have a different administration that comes in. And so for me, this has been my first experience in what feels like, since I've been doing domestic violence work to an extent, having that experience of going from one administration into another, and in this space being on the other side of it, where previously I was doing the work as an advocate or working in a resource center and doing the work from that perspective, whereas now being within the administration and realizing how things do change with the different leadership that may come in, and how at times it could seem almost like a little bit of crazy making to grantees when all of a sudden we go from one focus area to another, or we may have to ask for things that we may not have asked for in the past. And so I just want to put that out there to say that we appreciate everyone's patience with that as we are continuing to move through the transition period between administrations, which can take several months, and it's very normal that it takes several months. But I think when you're on the other side doing the work, it just feels a little bit confusing or at times challenging. And so we just want to acknowledge that and just appreciate that everyone is being patient and working with us as we're also awaiting new political leadership to come in and give us additional guidance and direction.
Thank you for that, Kenya. And the other thing I just want to add is, my experience working with the PHPSA office, and I think most of you have already had experience working with the PHPSA office, is that it's a group of people that are so dedicated and talented and smart, and also are very aware, because many of them have worked in the advocacy field on, as Kenya says, kind of the other side, of what our work lives are like. And they have a lot of demands coming down upon them from people higher up, but they're very protective of us in the field. and do whatever they can. And I just really want to say to all of those people who are on this webinar from your office, Kenya, thank you. And certainly to your boss, Mary Louise Kelly. I mean, you guys have just been really just an amazing funder to work with, and I know that all of us really appreciate that a lot. So we've got some time here. If people have questions, and I also want to thank those of you who did send some questions in advance to me, and they were interesting, and I hope we answered a bunch of them. I think we answered a bunch of them. I know one of the questions was, do we know when our next meeting is, and we don't. That is something that we tend to do at the meeting. We try to kind of zero in on a time period for the following meeting at the meeting that we're at, but we do not have a set schedule. And did you have answers to any of the other questions that people floated to us?
I'm going to have to look. Yeah, I tried to weave some of the answers in.
And I think you did.
Yeah. So I'd be interested if any of this was a surprise to you. I don't know, because some of you, there's some folks on this call that have been in this movement for a long time, and so have have a view of the DVRN. So that would be interesting to hear about. But or if people have any questions about the meeting next week, for those of you that are going to be there, or those of you that aren't going to be there, happy to
Hi,
whatever.
this is Leon. I have a question.
Sure.
For the that morning session where we're talking about our new centers, was there an expectation to do slides or how long we would have to present?
Question. Yeah, I don't think we communicated anything to you guys, did we?
No.
No, we've just been distracted by so many other things.
That's okay.
We are more communicative.
But Anne, that may answer her other question about communication styles.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think there's ever a requirement that you have slides. We also will have an LCD and a computer. So if it's easier for you to have a few slides, that could also work. I think we just wanted to give each of you all an opportunity. I think we said 10 minutes is what works. To just tell us, introduce yourself if you've got key staff hired, key approaches, sort of who you're working with. I think that's going to be really interesting, and opportunities for collaboration, which is what it says on the agenda. So we just wanted to give each new resource center, and Northwest Network, because again, their work has expanded. They've built a foundation in the first 3 years, but we just wanted to give that opportunity. So it can be very informal, but if a few slides, we can also, and you can just bring them on a flash drive, or you can email them to me, whatever. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Good. No, good question.
And just a note: are there other people who are not on this call that we need to communicate that to?
I think we have someone from all of those. Yeah, we've got someone on here from each. So if you're not the one who's coming to the meeting, make sure if you all could communicate that back to folks who will be at the meeting, who will be taking the lead on that kind of discussion. And for that discussion, I think if I remember that correctly, we're going to have a lot of the project specialists, the FIPSA staff who are connected with each of the resource centers, so they may also have some other, they may also want to add some things. The other thing I'd just say that, it used to be that our DVRN meetings were like 7 people, and now, like this meeting that we have, at any given time there may be 50 people in the room. And some of that's as the PIPSA office grown, which we're very excited about, and it's not a complaint at all that they're going to be, coming in and out of the meeting, around the different sections. But it's also the case that the resource centers, and maybe particularly for this first meeting, that we've got a number of resource centers who are bringing 2 to 4 people, and that's okay, but that makes it a different space also, and that's we want to maintain the culture of real collaboration and people kind of knowing who's in the room and who they're getting names to faces to names.
Yeah, and this is Kenya. I want to say something to that also about our participation as the FIPSA program staff coming to the meeting. We see it as a really good opportunity for us not only to just have face-to-face contact with everyone, because we're not always able to travel out, and meet together, but also as an opportunity to really listen in and hear and learn from what you all are experiencing and bringing back and what you're working on. And so I think sometimes it can be a little challenging to know kind of what our role is while we're there in the room. And so I know at the meeting next week, Mary Louise is going to talk a little bit about this, but just for the folks on the room, I don't want you to get the sense that when we're there at the DVRN meetings that we're there to, just kind of watch or question what's happening. But we're really there because we value the spirit of collaboration and partnership and our cooperative agreements, and we really want to approach the work that we're doing in a way where we're working together as partners. And so our presence at the DVRN meeting is not always for us to give additional guidance or to help make decisions, but it's really a great opportunity for us to listen and learn from you all so that we have more information to bring back as we're working on things here within the federal system, that we can then just have more information about how to respond on what the impact is that you all are seeing with our programs around the country based on policy decisions or funding decisions that are being made here. So I just want to put that out there, that it's a time for us to continue building relationships and just observing and listening, but not always doing the leading.
Thanks, Kenya. That's really been true throughout the history of our relationship with the FIPS office, and not anything we take for granted. So appreciate it.
And Kenya, my understanding is that there may be different people there on each of the 2 days, so people in your office have an opportunity to come. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We tried to be thoughtful about taking a look at the agenda and seeing when it would be most appropriate for different staff to be there, because a concern that we also have is that we don't want to be an overwhelming presence in the room, and we don't want to negatively impact any of the critical conversations or discussions that you all may need to have, where you may feel like, well, we shouldn't be talking about those things on federally funded time, or it may not be appropriate for our federal partners to be in the room to hear certain things. So we really don't want to be disruptive at the meeting. So we try to be cognizant of when it would be most beneficial for different program staff to be there, and also for many of us to have an opportunity to come to the meeting to meet different folks or spend time with different grantees that maybe we haven't been able to do recently. So we'll talk about that a little bit on the first day, and then I think we'll also need to just reiterate that on the second day as well.
Any other questions? I do realize webinars are not necessarily the best format for this, but.
Hi, this is Kim Gandy. I was muted. I was talking away and realized you weren't
sorry,
very
Kim.
good.
Oh, I hate that.
I hope you can recreate it as eloquently as I'm sure you did it the first time.
I didn't get very far in before I realized that other people were still talking. I was interested in the 2016, I guess it was a mission statement or statement of purpose for the DVRN, and it referred to public policy work, and there was some discussion of the difference or distinction between the National Task Force and the DVRN. But I wonder where that falls in terms of public policy. NNEDV is now on both, and I know that there are some things that we do jointly on the NTF. We'll do joint letters or joint comments. We'll work jointly on legislation as the NTF. Does the DVRN do that kind of legislative or public policy work? And if so, how is it coordinated?
That's a great question, Kim. And that's one of the questions that came up as we were doing the work prior to landing on this this purpose statement. And I think I'll start, and Sue would certainly weigh in on this too. But I think the individual DVRN members are kind of situated differently, or along a kind of continuum of the extent to which they are involved in legislative advocacy, and with organizations that are primarily or solely funded with federal funds. They have the obvious limitations of not doing legislative, lobbying and legislative work. Other resource centers being part of larger organizations that have the resources and the history and the relationships and are quite much more engaged, not with their federal funds, obviously, but the larger organization is more involved, and they tend to be the ones that are also on the NTF. So the DVRN has not taken positions. It's not common for the DVRN to write letters, to sign as the DVRN, as the NTF does. The NTF signs the NTF and has a presence as the NTF in the policy world. The DVRN has not. There are times when we communicate as the DVRN to federal agencies. So we have done that at the request. Actually, Mark Greenberg, when he was the policy director and then the interim assistant secretary at ACF, asked for our recommendations on administrative actions that they could take when Congress wasn't doing anything. And so we organized that as a DVRN. We identified priorities. This was a couple years ago. We identified, what our administrative priorities were. You wouldn't be surprised by any of them. Like one of them was reissuing with a current date the coordinated guidance on emergency services that immigrants are allowed to access. So a lot of that was underscoring things that were part of other conversations. So that's an example of when we acted as the DVRN. But that's a question that came up in our discussions: is are there issues on which it would be helpful for the DVRN to make statements about? My guess is that if we come to the conclusion that there are, they would tend to be more, non-legislative policy or practice issues, like the DVRN after, this set of agencies has looked at whether mandatory reporting is helpful, or whether mandatory reporting rules should be changed because of what we are learning about the ways in which they impact help seeking by survivors, and that comes from work that the National Hotline and Northwest Network did together in terms of surveys and additional conversations about that. So that's an example of something where the DVRN, if it engages in critical conversation and we feel like it's going to be helpful to move something forward, to make communicate as the DVRN, we might do that. But it's not been a significant part of our history, particularly in the legislative arena. More comfortable, certainly signed on to comments related to rules, or and sometimes we haven't done that as a DVRN, but sometimes a subset of DVRN agencies or DVRN members have done that. So that's what I would say. Sue, would you add to that or disagree with what I said? Or
No, I think that's right. And I think, historically we have never, with the exceptions of what you talked about, Ann, done anything as a DVRN.
Right.
In those ways.
In those ways, yeah.
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 Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks. I just wondered when I saw it in that statement of mission, I wondered whether that was a change.
No, because the resource centers are very involved in policy advocacy, not necessarily policy, legislative, congressional policy, but in each of the spheres, like the health resource center is very involved in health policy. The BWJP works on policy issues. Yeah, so it's that kind of reference rather than the legislative policy.
Okay, of course.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And the other role certainly that DVRN agencies play is backup support to those of you that are can stomach working with Congress and have the resources non-federal resources to do that. So a not uncommon role for the DVRN agencies is confirming the research behind providing the support, research or practice support for different kinds of positions, checking out statistics that our legislators are using or the vice president is using, and those kinds of things. So that's playing in that kind of appropriate resource center role to support good public policy.
Any other questions?
Is anyone else asking a question while they're on mute?
Well, hearing none. Kenya, Ann, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we let people go?
No, except we're excited to have you join us and add the richness that you're going to add to this process. I'm excited about seeing you all and introducing some of you to some of our DVRN colleagues. And I think the one other thing I would say is that NNEDV, as Sue mentioned earlier, NNEDV was a DVRN member when it had the Open Doors, when it was serving as the Open Doors TA provider. And I think one of the things that we appreciated about NNEDV being a member of the DVRN is it helped support better coordination between the DVRN members and the coalitions, and that's something we're looking for. It just happened more naturally because you were in the midst and in the room as opposed to not in the room. So that I think we're looking. That seems more important than ever now that we are coordinating efforts across all these different relationships. So that's a particular benefit, I think.
Yep. And this is Kenya. I was just going to say that we're all very excited to see you all next week while you're in town, and look forward to a really engaging meeting. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at least we'll see some of you next week. And you certainly have my email address, so you can send me questions. And if you're not able to be at the meeting next week, you can send them through your colleagues or you can send them to me. So to be continued for sure. Okay? So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you, Ann and Kenya. Great job. Bye.